The fate of a promising football player can change in an instant. One day, you'll be the new sensation, a young prodigy ready to dominate the pitch. In the next, his name becomes just a distant memory, a story of wasted opportunities. Royston Drenthe experienced this contrast in an extreme way. He went from top to oblivion at a speed no one could have predicted. He wore the Real Madrid shirt, played alongside legends, and was seen as the future of left back. But where did it all start to go wrong? How did a player who seemed destined for greatness end up lost in anonymity, with no money, no prestige, and no football? If I told you that one mistake could destroy an entire career, would you believe it? Drenthe wasn't just another promise that didn't come to fruition. He wasted talent, fortune, and opportunities in a way that few players have managed. That Dutch boy who one day shone in Champions League, today he lives a destiny that no one would have imagined. At his peak, he had everything any player dreamed of. Millions in the account, luxurious cars, exclusive parties, millionaire contracts. But instead of building a legacy on the field, he got lost in the world of distractions, spent without limits, and made decisions that cost everything he had achieved. The money is gone. The contracts are gone. The name Drenthe was erased from football. And in a turn of events that no one expected, he decided to swap the grass for the stage. Yes, the former Real Madrid player turned rapper. But was this change a new beginning or just another chapter in its decline? How does an elite athlete sink so quickly? How does a young millionaire find himself bankrupt just a few years later? This isn't just a case of a player not living up to his potential. It's a real warning to all football promises. But Drenthe didn't fall overnight. Before bankruptcy, before oblivion, before rap, he was a young prodigy with the world at his feet. Real Madrid fans believed he would be the future, the new jewel of Dutch football, a player destined for greatness. But were there signs from the beginning that this would all fall apart? Was his fate already sealed before he even reached the top? To understand your fall, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment when the world believed that Drenthe would be a legend. Since he was a child, Royston Drenthe has never been like other kids. While many dreamed of one day becoming football players, he was absolutely certain he would be a star. Growing up in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, in a harsh reality, and without great opportunities, he knew that his talent was his one-way ticket to a better future. But he didn't just want to be a professional player. He wanted to be the best. He wanted his name to be spoken around the world. I wanted stardom, fortune, fame. From the first touch of the ball, Drenthe attracted attention. His style was different. He played as if he were in a World Cup final every game. He had speed, technique, aggression, and, above all, confidence. For a slight boy who grew up facing adversity, taking the field was the only way to command respect, to stand out, and he did it like no one else. When he started playing for Feyenoord's youth teams, it quickly became clear that he was special. A fullback who attacked like a winger, dribbled like a midfielder, and ran like a sprinter. But along with his talent, there was something that set him apart. His mentality was that of a star. And he knew it. Drenthe didn't just want to win. He wanted to be admired, applauded, recognized. For him, football wasn't just about playing well. It was about being a showman. On the field, his energy was contagious. He played with maximum intensity, always taking responsibility, always wanting to be in the spotlight. But this strong personality, which at first seemed like an asset, would soon become a curse. The first big turning point in his career came in 2007, when he was called up to play for the Netherlands at the Under-21 European Championship. It was his chance to show the world that he wasn't just another promising young man. He wanted to be the star of the competition, and that's exactly what happened. During the tournament, Drenthe destroyed his opponents. His runs were unstoppable. His passes were accurate. His confidence was unshakable. With each game, his name gained more strength. The European press began calling him Dutch football's next great star. In the final of the tournament, under the eyes of scouts from the biggest clubs in Europe, Drenthe performed brilliantly. The Netherlands won. He was voted the best player in the championship. And there, his life changed forever. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Agents, managers, everyone wanted to know, who was this kid who looked like a veteran playing against young people his own age? Dutch newspapers said he was ready to shine at a big club, but no one expected what came next. Real Madrid entered the game. The Spanish club, which was going through a period of renewal, saw in Drenthe a rare jewel, an explosive, offensive player with personality to spare, the type of athlete who could light a game on fire with a single sprint. And when the proposal arrived, Drenthe didn't hesitate. It was Real Madrid, the biggest club in the world. How could he refuse? But here was the first big warning. Drenthe was not prepared for this leap. Players making this transition so early need something essential to survive at the top. Discipline, maturity, a sense of reality. But Drenthe was enchanted by the idea of stardom. For him, football has always been a spectacle. And now, he was about to be part of the biggest stage on the planet. The signing of the contract was an event in itself. Millions of euros, camera flashes, headlines praising Real Madrid's new signing. He arrived like a star and behaved like a star. But was he really ready for all this? The weight of wearing the white shirt, the pressure of playing alongside legends, the need to prove, at each training session, that you deserve to be there? Drenthe never doubted himself. And perhaps that was his biggest mistake. Believing that talent alone was enough. Believing that he had already reached the top. When, in fact, he was just at the beginning of the real battle. What happened behind the scenes at Real Madrid in Drenthe's first months? Has he managed to adapt to the new reality? Or did the first signs of his fall begin to appear right there, in front of everyone, but without him even realizing it? Since this story has already made you curious, leave your like so that more people can find out what really happened to this player. Now, let's dive into the defining moments that changed everything. Royston Drenthe arrived at Real Madrid as a child prodigy, a young man of just 20 years old with the world at his feet. The most powerful club on the planet had spent a significant amount of money to bring him from Feyenoord, and the expectation was clear. He would be the new Roberto Carlos. The Spanish press praised his speed, his boldness in attack, his ability to carry the ball like few others. The fans, still missing the legendary Brazilian fullback, wanted a worthy replacement. Drenthe needed to prove that she deserved to be there. His performance was worthy of a star. In front of the cameras, he wore the iconic white shirt, smiled confidently, and declared that this was the beginning of a glorious era. "I came to be one of the best in the world," he said, with the same self-confidence that had gotten him there. But words are just words, and at a club like Real Madrid, they mean nothing if they are not accompanied by performance on the pitch. In the first training sessions, Drenthe wanted to impress. He stood out with his energy, his intensity, and his fearless attitude. But at the same time, something began to become evident. He played as if he were in a street tournament, without much tactical concern, without discipline, without measuring efforts. In some situations, this made him an unpredictable and exciting player. In others, a risk. He ran more than he thought, tried unnecessary dribbles, and often forgot his defensive responsibilities. But he didn't seem worried. In his first official game for Real Madrid, a preseason friendly, Drenthe scored a spectacular goal from outside the box. A strong, undefendable shot that made the stadium explode. The merengue fans were excited. Had they finally found a successor for Roberto Carlos? He left the field with an ovation. His name was in the newspaper headlines the next day. But behind this moment of glory, an invisible problem began to grow. The Real Madrid board had already identified a warning sign. Drenthe did not train with the same intensity as he played. While his teammates arrived early for their physical preparation sessions and followed their exercise routine to the letter, he showed a certain disinterest. I thought that talent was enough, that the brilliance of the game spoke louder than the exhaustive repetition of training. This bothered the coaches, and at Real Madrid, no one can afford to upset the coaches. As the weeks passed, the situation began to become untenable. Drenthe, used to being the center of attention, did not accept being just another part of the cast. In his mind, he was a star. He always wanted to play. He wanted the spotlight. He wanted to feel the fans shouting his name. But there was a problem. In the same position as him, there was a young Brazilian named Marcelo. Marcelo did not have the same triumphal entry as Drenthe. He arrived at the club in a more discreet way, without great expectations. But unlike the Dutchman, he was focused on learning. He trained more than the others, listened carefully to the advice of veterans, and, little by little, began to conquer his space. While Drenthe saw himself as a ready-made star, Marcelo understood that he still needed to evolve. Evolving was exactly what he did. Little by little, the coaches began to trust the Brazilian more. Drenthe, who had minutes on the field at the beginning of the season, began to lose space. First, there were small cuts to the lineup. Then, the exclusion of important games. The Dutchman didn't like it. Instead of reacting with work, he responded with indiscipline. He arrived late for training. He made jokes at the wrong times. He demonstrated behavior that bothered the coaching staff. He saw himself as an unfair star, while the coaches saw him as an immature and uncommitted player. And then, the conflicts began. During a training session, after being criticized by one of the assistant coaches, Drenthe hit back in front of everyone. He questioned the coach's decision and complained about the lack of opportunities. The episode went down badly within the cast. At Real Madrid, hierarchy is sacred. No young person challenges their elders and gets away with it. But Drenthe didn't see it that way. For him, he was being wronged. I couldn't understand how a player of his quality didn't get more chances. He felt bigger than the club was willing to treat him, and this arrogance began to accelerate his downfall. Off the field, his life was also beginning to attract attention. Drenthe loved parties. He liked to enjoy his fame, go out to exclusive events, circulate among millionaires, rappers, and celebrities. I spent money like there was no tomorrow. Sports cars, designer clothes, extravagant jewelry. Nothing seemed enough for him. And little by little, the coaches began to notice that his performance in training was not just a matter of attitude. He wasn't 100% physically. The restless nights, the sleepless hours, the excesses, everything began to be reflected on the field. His peak was no longer the same. His physical recovery took longer than usual. His explosiveness, which had always been his greatest weapon, was waning. And in elite football, any weakness means someone will take your place. Meanwhile, Marcelo continued to grow. He became a more reliable, more consistent, more technical player. The coaches no longer had any doubts. He would be Real Madrid's left-back of the future. And Drenthe, he, who was hired to be the star of the position, now became a problem to be solved. The club needed to decide what to do with him. The board tried to advise him. The cast's veterans tried to warn him, but he didn't listen. He believed he could still reverse the situation. The problem is that, in football, the chances are not infinite. At Real Madrid, even less. If you don't take advantage of the opportunity, soon someone more disciplined and determined will take it for themselves. Drenthe still thought the club would change its mind, that he would have another chance. But he didn't realize that, behind the scenes, the leaders had already made a decision. His time at Real Madrid was coming to an end. And the question was no longer whether he would be able to regain his space. The question was, where would he go now? The fall of Royston Drenthe did not happen overnight. It was not an isolated event, a single fatal error. It was a gradual process, a succession of bad choices, of ignored signals, of warnings that went unnoticed, or worse, were simply ignored. He still wore the Real Madrid shirt. He still trained every day with some of the best players in the world. But the truth was that, away from the pitch, his career was already starting to go off the rails. Money, which for many players is a prize, has become a curse for him. With $1 million contract signed, a bank account always full, and an endless stream of sponsors, Drenthe believed he had won in life before he had even proven anything in football. For him, being a Real Madrid player meant more than titles and trophies. It meant luxury parties, sports cars, diamond-studded watches, and he wanted to enjoy every second of this new reality. His first months in Madrid were a parade of extravagance. Every weekend, a different car. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Bentleys. He liked to be seen. He liked to be noticed. If he entered a party, he wanted everyone to know that Royston Drenthe, a Real Madrid player, had arrived, and he made a point of surrounding himself with the wrong people, dodgy businessmen, supposed friends who were only there to take advantage of their fortune, women who wanted the attention of a young millionaire. He didn't realize, or didn't want to realize, that all of this had a price. The club was discreetly trying to get his attention. Coaches warned about his behavior off the field. The veterans of the squad gave advice, tried to explain that money and fame disappear quickly in football, that the only way to stay at the top was with discipline and dedication. But Drenthe didn't listen. He believed he was different, that nothing would affect him, that his career was guaranteed. The Spanish press, always eager for scandals, began to realize that something was strange. Some discreet reports pointed out that Drenthe was not only seen at training and games, but also at luxurious parties that lasted until dawn. The rumors started to grow. Supposed fights in nightclubs, bottles of champagne popping all night, going out with groups of people that no one knew exactly where they came from. Little by little, the narrative changed. Drenthe was no longer just Real Madrid's young talent. He was starting to be seen as a problem. It was then that the heaviest rumors emerged. Drugs. It was impossible to confirm, but stories began to circulate. Drenthe was said to attend private parties where alcohol and illicit substances flowed freely, that his early mornings were not just filled with loud music and fun, but also with excesses that exceeded any acceptable limit for an elite athlete. No concrete evidence was presented. No official complaint was made. But in football, sometimes rumors are enough to destroy a career. Real Madrid tried to protect him. The club knew that dealing with young players was often a challenge. Not everyone has the maturity to manage fame and money at such a young age. Drenthe received internal warnings, private conversations with directors, requests for more commitment. But he didn't take anything seriously. He thought they were just exaggerations, that everything would be fine. That talent would always speak louder. The problem was that while he was enjoying his new life, other players were working. Marcelo, who had arrived at the club almost at the same time as him, did not appear in the headlines for partying. It appeared due to his evolution on the field. While Drenthe spent fortunes on cars and watches, Marcelo spent extra hours improving his technique, gaining the trust of his coaches. And in football, that makes all the difference. When Drenthe realized that her situation was beginning to worsen, it was too late. He no longer had prestige within the locker room. The coaches didn't trust him. The board was already considering options to negotiate him. And to make matters worse, the fans, who initially supported him, began to lose patience. The boos became frequent. With each bad game, with each mistake made on the field, the cries of impatience increased. Drenthe went from promise to disappointment in record time. And even so, he still didn't accept that he needed to change. He continued to deny the signs. He continued to believe that somehow everything would work itself out, that his career would fix itself. But in football, nothing can be resolved alone. If you don't dedicate yourself, if you don't prove your worth, the club will soon find someone who will do it in your place. And that's exactly what happened. Real Madrid, seeing that the situation was irreversible, made a decision. It was time to get rid of him. But selling a player with so many problems was not easy. No big club wanted to bet on an athlete with such a troubled reputation. The only solution was to lend it. Send him to a smaller team, where he could regain his form away from the distractions of Madrid. Drenthe didn't know it yet, but that moment marked the beginning of his definitive fall. The player who had been heralded as the new Roberto Carlos, who arrived at Real Madrid as a rising star, was now being discarded. But did he still have a chance to reverse his story? Or was his descent just a matter of time? The verdict has been given. Real Madrid no longer had space for Royston Drenthe. The club, which had already invested heavily in his talent, now wanted distance. He wasn't part of the plans. He wasn't seen as a reliable athlete. He didn't have enough commitment to wear the shirt of the most prestigious team on the planet. But simply selling it was not an option. No big club wanted to risk millions on a player who, instead of evolving, seemed to regress. The only way out was a loan, and that's how Drenthe ended up at Hercules CF. Hercules, a modest club in the Spanish First Division, was not the destination he imagined when he signed a contract with Real Madrid. But he still saw himself as a star. "I thought it was just a bad phase, that I would shine in a smaller team and soon be back at the top." He believed the talent that took him to Real Madrid was still there. But what he didn't realize was that, in football, talent without discipline means nothing. And, even worse, he was about to discover that the problems that kept him away from Madrid would follow him anywhere. When she arrived at the Hercules, Drenthe tried to convince herself that this was temporary. But reality hit hard. The club did not have the same structure as Real Madrid. The training wasn't at the same level. The stadiums weren't as bright. The teammates weren't international stars. It was a brutal reality check. And, to make matters worse, he realized something that bothered him deeply. Here, no one treated him like a star. In the first games, he tried to show service. "I wanted to prove that I was still an elite player." But his physique was no longer the same, and the months of poorly spent training began to take their toll. His speed was no longer as explosive. His breath didn't last the 90 minutes. His mistakes began to pile up, and the patience of the club, which signed him hoping he would make a difference, began to run out. If things weren't going well on the field, off at the situation was even worse. Drenthe still led the same lifestyle he had at Real Madrid, but now, without the Spanish giant's astronomical salary, the numbers have started to add up. The money, which seemed infinite, began to disappear. Expensive cars, luxurious parties, unnecessary trips, impulsive purchases. He never learned how to manage his wealth because he never imagined he would need to. But now, for the first time, the bill was coming. Financial problems began to emerge discreetly, almost imperceptibly for someone who still thought he was a millionaire. Small debts here and there, some late bills, financial commitments that he didn't take seriously. But the problem with living on the edge is that it only takes one slip for everything to fall apart. And Drenthe, sunk in his bubble of illusions, was about to lose control of his own life. As financial chaos unfolded behind the scenes, his relationship with Hercules began to deteriorate. He didn't accept criticism. He felt that any attempt to help him was an affront. He began clashing with managers, questioning the decisions of the coaching staff, and publicly complaining about his situation at the club. For him, the problem wasn't him. The problem was the others. And then came the episode that once and for all symbolized his decline. In a decisive game, Drenthe was excluded from the starting lineup. The coach, tired of his lack of commitment, opted for another player. Drenthe was furious. He refused to train, abandoned club activities for days, and, according to reports, said he was not a player for a small team like Hercules. The news fell like a bomb. The Spanish press, which had already become accustomed to the player's problems, was unforgiving. Headlines painted him as undisciplined, arrogant, a wasted talent. And once again, Drenthe couldn't understand how he had gotten there. At that point, he no longer had the support of the locker room. The managers wanted to get rid of him as quickly as possible. Fans, who were initially excited about the arrival of a former Real Madrid man, now saw him as a signing mistake. What was supposed to be a fresh start turned into a disaster. He could no longer gain a foothold anywhere, and the worst was yet to come. When his loan contract ended, Real Madrid simply wanted nothing to do with him. There were no plans to reinstate him to the cast. There was no expectation that he would wear the white shirt again. He was no longer the club's problem. If before he had been loaned out in the hope that he would regain his best form, now the objective was just one: to get rid of him once and for all. But who would be willing to sign a player who seemed increasingly far from elite football? The answer to that question would define the next chapter in Drenthe's trajectory. And this time, the scenario would be even worse. If in Hercules, he already felt like he was falling, now he was about to enter an abyss of no return. And believe me, what happened next was even more surprising. I know this story has already touched you, so subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because the next events will leave you speechless. Drenthe's fate took a turn no one could have imagined. Royston Drenthe still refused to believe his career was in decline. For him, football had always been a spectacle, and he had always been the star. But reality no longer followed his illusion. After being discarded by Real Madrid and failing at Hercules, his reputation was tarnished. No big club was willing to bet on him. His name was no longer mentioned among the talents of European football. He was slowly disappearing before the eyes of the world. It was then that an opportunity in the Premier League arose. Everton, a traditional English club, decided to take a risk. It was Drenthe's last chance to redeem himself in elite football, a chance to prove that he could still be useful in a high-level championship. But was he ready for this responsibility? From day one, it was clear that Drenthe had learned nothing from his previous falls. The same mistakes were repeated. He still believed that talent was enough, that his story would speak louder than effort. And in England, this mentality is fatal. The Premier League demands maximum intensity, absolute commitment, a war mentality. Drenthe, on the other hand, continued to live as if he were still in the prime of his undisciplined youth. In his first games for Everton, he tried to show that he was still the same explosive player he was at the beginning of his career. Some plays caught attention. A sprint here, a brilliant pass there, but nothing beyond that. It lacked consistency. With each match, his influence diminished. His physique was no longer the same, his confidence was shaken. His position within the squad was becoming less and less relevant. Coaches began to realize he was not a reliable player. His attitude in training was questionable. His dedication was far from ideal. And then he started to be left aside. With little chance to play, Drenthe reacted in the worst possible way. He moved away from the group, increased his nightly outings, and became a problem behind the scenes. Everton realized they couldn't count on him. His time at the English club ended lackluster, without prominence, without anything that would make him remembered. Another wasted opportunity, and with that, His career in high-level football was practically over. But Drenthe still didn't accept reality. He refused to believe he was being forgotten. Thus began a phase of frustrated attempts to revive his career. The next destination? Russia. Spartak Vladikavkaz, a modest Russian football club, emerged as an option for him to try and regain his form. But this move sounded more like desperation than real strategy. Russian football was no longer a path to growth, but rather a hiding place for players who had failed in the European elite. And the truth is, from day one, Drenthe felt like she was somewhere she didn't belong. The adaptation was a disaster. The extreme cold, the language barrier, the physical and aggressive style of play of the Russian league. Nothing was in Drenthe's favor. And as expected, his passage was absolutely forgettable. Few performances, no real impact, and another frustrating chapter in his career. After Russia, Drenthe still tried again. This time, in Turkey, Kayseri Erciyesspor, a small club in the Turkish league, opened its doors to him. But at this point, what was left of his career was no more than a shadow of what it could have been. He no longer attracted attention. It was no longer a headline. It was no longer a topic. The football world had already moved on. Drenthe, who was once compared to Roberto Carlos, who once played alongside Cristiano Ronaldo, was now buried in anonymity. And the most impressive of all this, he still believed he could come back. But back to where? Which club? Who would still bet on a player who seemed to have lost everything? Time was running against him. And his next decision would decide once and for all whether his career still had salvation, or whether this would just be the beginning of his final downfall. The football world had already moved on. Drenthe, who was once compared to Roberto Carlos, who once played alongside Cristiano Ronaldo, was now buried in anonymity. And the most impressive of all this, he still believed he could come back. But back to where? Which club? Who would still bet on a player who seemed to have lost everything? But time was against him. Would the next step define his destiny? Would it be the path to redemption or the point of no return? The news took everyone by surprise. Royston Drenthe, the former Real Madrid player, was bankrupt. It was hard to believe. An athlete who had signed a $1 million contract with one of the biggest clubs in the world, who had received astronomical salaries in Europe, and who had once boasted sports cars, luxurious watches and mansions, now found himself facing a harsh reality. His money had disappeared. The headlines were relentless. From stardom to bankruptcy, said the newspapers. The public could not understand how a player who, at his peak, earned millions of euros a year, could have lost everything so quickly. But the truth is that money was never treated by Drenthe as a resource to be managed. It was just fuel for the extravagant lifestyle he always wanted to lead. And when contracts started to dwindle, he never worried about slowing down. The problem started early. From his first months at Real Madrid, Drenthe spent as if his fortune were infinite. He wanted to live like the biggest stars in world football, without realizing that to do so, he needed more than just talent. He needed career longevity. He surrounded himself with extreme luxury imported cars, extravagant trips and parties that cost small fortunes. For him, spending was part of the status of being an elite player. He didn't worry about tomorrow, because he believed there would always be another $1 million contract waiting for him. But the contracts started to disappear. First, Real Madrid dropped him. So, the smaller clubs he played for were unable to pay the same amounts. But even so, his standard of living did not change. He continued his outrageous spending, maintaining the lifestyle of an elite player even when he was no longer one. And that was when the financial problems began to become irreversible. One of the biggest traps for players who reach the top quickly is the illusion that the money never runs out. Drenthe was confident of a steady stream of earnings, but never learned how to manage her fortune. He made bad investments, bet money on businesses that didn't work out, and trusted people who had no interest in helping him preserve his assets. He didn't have a financial plan. He didn't have support from reliable managers. He just spent, and when he realized it, it was too late. Reports indicate that, at one point in his life, Drenthe had more than 10 luxury cars parked in his garage. Models from brands like Lamborghini, Ferrari, and Bentley, all bought without planning, often just on impulse. He prided himself on never repeating a car on his nightly outings. But there was a problem. He didn't realize that each of these vehicles came with huge maintenance, tax, and depreciation costs. What once seemed like a status symbol has turned into an unsustainable financial burden. But it wasn't just cars that Drenthe made his fortune. Parties, international trips, designer clothes, personalized jewelry, and five-star hotels were part of her routine. In a single night, reports indicate he spent tens of thousands of euros just on drinks for friends and guests at an exclusive nightclub. What seemed like fun to him was actually a one-way path to financial collapse. And, like many gamblers who don't know how to manage their fortunes, Drenthe also surrounded himself with the wrong people. Shady businessmen, friends who were only around as long as the money flowed, advisors who cared more about profiting at your expense than helping you maintain your financial stability. He trusted people he shouldn't have, and when money started to run out, those same people disappeared. The moment the truth came out was devastating. Drenthe, who once lived in absolute luxury, had to face a reality he never imagined. He was broke. His accounts no longer supported his lifestyle. His assets began to be sold. Debts accumulated. Creditors were knocking on the door. And for the first time, he realized that the millionaire player he once was now no longer existed. If before he was compared to Roberto Carlos, if he once shared a dressing room with football legends, now he was on the same list as so many other former promises who lost everything. Football has a long history of players who made fortunes and ended up with nothing. Now, Drenthe was another name in that statistic, but he wasn't ready to accept that reality yet. In his mind, there was still a way to change the course of this story. The problem was that, with football turning his back on him, he would start looking for a new path. And this time, the solution he found was even more unexpected. The football world no longer wanted anything to do with Royston Drenthe. He was broke, without a club, without prestige, and without prospects. That explosive boy who one day landed at Real Madrid with great promise was now nothing more than a forgotten former player, more remembered for his problems off the field than for the talent he once demonstrated. But instead of accepting reality and trying to rebuild his football career, Drenthe made a decision that no one expected. He still wanted to be famous, but this time, it wouldn't be with the ball at his feet. It was then that the news came that shocked everyone. Royston Drenthe would become a rapper. That's right, the former player who once shared a dressing room with Cristiano Ronaldo and Kaká, who was signed by the biggest club in the world, now wanted to be successful in the world of music. It was a radical change, a complete deviation from what anyone imagined for an athlete who could still try to rebuild his football career. But for Drenthe, this was his new big bet. If football rejected him, he would find another way to remain in the spotlight. But did he really know what he was getting into? The announcement of Drenthe's new career was met with incredulity. The sports media didn't know how to react. On one side, there were those who laughed at the situation, considering it yet another eccentricity from a player who never took his profession seriously. On the other, some were still trying to understand if he was serious, or if it was just another desperate attempt to stay relevant. But Drenthe wasn't kidding. He was determined to be a rap star. He adopted a new stage name, released his first songs, and tried to promote his new identity. But the problem was that, in the world of music, talent and fame in football meant absolutely nothing. If he wanted to be taken seriously, He needed to prove he had something to offer. And that's exactly when everything started to fall apart. If in football Drenthe had natural ability, in music the situation was completely different. Their songs were not impressive. His flow didn't stand out. His lyrics lacked depth. His beats seemed generic. He was a former player desperately trying to reinvent himself without really understanding what he was doing. And, to make matters worse, the football public didn't support him. Fans who once thrilled with his moves now saw his new career as a joke. Drenthe became a meme. His songs were shared on social media, but not because they were good, but because people thought it was funny to see a former player trying to be a rapper. Critics were unforgiving. Music blogs mocked his attempts. YouTubers made videos mocking their clips. He wanted to be taken seriously, but no one could see him beyond the figure of the player who wasted his career. And the worst of all, he didn't see a problem with that. Drenthe seemed indifferent to the criticism. In his interviews, he said that he felt freer now than when he was a player. He said that he was never really passionate about football, that he only played because he was talented, but that his true dream was music. But was this true, or just an attempt to justify his failures? Even with the rejection, Drenthe insisted. He released new songs, tried to improve his production, and forced his presence on social media. But with each new release, its credibility diminished further. He was not seen as a legitimate rapper, but rather as a passing curiosity, an exotic figure who would soon be forgotten. Football no longer wanted him. Neither does the music. But would Drenthe finally understand that her path was reaching a point of no return? Now, I want to know your opinion. Do you think Drenthe really believed he could make it in music? Or was this just a reflection of desperation? Comment below. Reality hit hard. Royston Drenthe had failed as a rapper. His attempt to reinvent his career in music didn't bring recognition, didn't bring respect, and most importantly, didn't bring money. The rap industry wasn't like football, where all it took was raw talent to get noticed. There, credibility was earned with effort, and Drenthe had already arrived with a destroyed image. His name was more associated with jokes than hit songs. The bills kept coming. Money, which once seemed infinite, no longer existed. Luxurious parties are a thing of the past. The sports cars were sold. The extravagant lifestyle has become unsustainable. Drenthe found himself at a crossroads. He was no longer an elite player, nor a music star. But one thing was certain, he still needed money. It was then that the inevitable decision came. He would return to football, but back to where? The big clubs in Europe had already moved on. Drenthe was no longer young, his name no longer caused excitement, and his history of indiscipline made everything even more difficult. No high-level team would bet on a player who had lost his way, but he didn't care. I just wanted a club, a new chance. The first attempt to return took place in his homeland. He signed with Reading in England's second division. The club didn't have the glamour of Real Madrid, nor the competitiveness of the Premier League, but it seemed like a good starting point. At first, Drenthe seemed motivated. He said in interviews that he was focused, that he had learned from past mistakes, and that he wanted to take advantage of this new opportunity. But it didn't take long for reality to show that he was no longer the same player. The time he spent away from football took its toll. Physically, Drenthe was far below what a professional athlete needs to compete at a high level. His sprints were no longer explosive. His resistance had decreased. His body no longer responded in the same way, and that was evident with each game. The fans, who initially showed curiosity at his arrival, soon lost patience. Performances were lackluster. Mistakes became frequent, and the impression that he no longer belonged to that level of football became increasingly clear. Coaches started leaving him on the bench. His morale within the cast collapsed. Once again, he was lost. But he didn't give up. "I still believed I could turn things around," When his time at Reading came to an end, Drenthe returned to the Netherlands, trying to reclaim his identity in the football where it all began. This time he signed with Sparta Rotterdam. It was his last attempt to rescue his career. But now there was something different. Drenthe no longer carried the same arrogance as before. He knew that his name was no longer synonymous with prestige. This time, he needed to truly prove his worth. But proving something on the field requires more than desire. It requires physicality. It requires rhythm. It requires dedication. And Drenthe no longer had any of that. The years of parties, wild living, sleepless nights, and poorly spent training had taken a heavy toll. His body was no longer at the level of a professional player. He tried, but he couldn't. His movements were slower. His sprints no longer scared his opponents. He was no longer the same player who one day made Real Madrid believe they had the new Roberto Carlos in their hands. And it was then that Drenthe had to face the hardest truth of all. His time in top-level football was over. But what would he do now? If football didn't want him anymore, and music didn't want him anymore, what would be the next step? That was the question he needed to answer. But to do that, he would first have to accept his new reality. Royston Drenthe, a name that was once synonymous with promises, million-dollar contracts, and the glitter of football's biggest stages, was now just a classic example of what happens when talent and discipline don't go together. The boy who was once compared to Roberto Carlos, who shared the dressing room with Cristiano Ronaldo and Kaká, now found himself without a club, without money, and without direction. But the worst was yet to come. He wasn't just a forgotten player. He had become a symbol of failure. The newspapers were unforgiving. Relentless headlines plastered his story of downfall, each crueler than the next. From Real Madrid to bankruptcy, Royston Drenthe's unbelievable downfall. From football promise to failed rapper, the player who wasted everything. The media no longer treated him as an athlete, nor even as a celebrity. Now he was a case study, a warning to young up-and-comers about the dangers of fame and lack of discipline. If before his life was full of spotlights, now Drenthe was being exposed in a different way. He was no longer in the spotlight for his plays or his sprints. Now, he was remembered for his mistakes. The same journalists who once praised his talent now used him as an example of how a lack of commitment can destroy a career. The name Drenthe has become synonymous with waste. And how did Drenthe react to all this? At first, he tried to deny it. In interviews, he insisted that his career was not over yet, that he still had a lot to offer, that his return to football was a matter of time. But time passed, and nothing happened. The big clubs didn't want him anymore. The minor leagues were only willing to offer paltry contracts. And the truth began to become impossible to ignore. It was then that he finally started to admit it. In an interview that quickly spread across the sporting world, Drenthe said, "I made a lot of mistakes. I didn't take football seriously. I didn't take advantage of the opportunities one had. I should have listened more." But did this confession mean anything at that point? Repentance came too late. Football has no patience for second chances when the player doesn't want to change. And Drenthe had already wasted all the chances the sport gave him. What happened to him wasn't just a decline in performance. It was a public implosion. It wasn't just one player who fell in level. It was a phenomenon. And that's the cruelest part of this story. Drenthe was not silently forgotten. He was exposed, ridiculed, turned into an example of everything a player shouldn't do. The fans, who previously supported him, now made fun of his name. On social media, memes appeared with images of him at Real Madrid alongside photos of him as a rapper, accompanied by phrases such as "from champion to failed singer," or "the player who exchanged goals for rhymes and failed at both." On sports programs, analysts used his story to warn young prospects about the dangers of fame and lack of commitment. Drenthe became a living warning about what happens when a player forgets that talent alone is not enough. His former teammates also commented on his fall. Some expressed sadness, saying he could have had a brilliant career if he had made better choices. Others were more blunt, claiming he never took football seriously enough to become a legend. What was once just a misstep was now a definitive verdict. Drenthe wasted his talent, and everyone knew it. But perhaps worst of all was the feeling of isolation. Drenthe, who always surrounded himself with people during his glory days, now saw his circle of friends disappear. Many of those who were by his side at parties and in moments of ostentation disappeared as soon as they realized that he no longer had the money to support that lifestyle. The player who once seemed to have the world at his feet was now alone, facing the consequences of his own mistakes. And the reality was harsh. Opportunities in football no longer existed. His career as a rapper was a failure. The money was gone. What was left for Royston Drenthe? He tried to convince himself that he could still turn things around, but even he no longer seemed to believe that idea. The impact was brutal. Drenthe began to be remembered not for his goals, not for his sprints, not for the talent he once had. He came to be remembered for his mistakes, his excesses, his wasted opportunities, and little by little, he began to accept that his story was already written. But was this really the last page of his career? Or would Drenthe still try one last trick to change her destiny? If this story has stuck with you so far, leave a like so that more people know the truth behind the fall of Royston Drenthe. Because believe me, what comes next is even more surprising. Royston Drenthe was still alive in fans' memories, but not for the reason he would have liked. His name was not mentioned alongside football legends, nor was he remembered for titles and achievements. Instead, he became an example of what happens when talent doesn't go hand in hand with discipline. One of those players who had everything to be giants, but who, through their own choices, got lost along the way. But what if everything had been different? This is the question that never leaves the mind of anyone who saw Drenthe at his peak. What if he had made other choices? If I had followed the right path? If, instead of diving into parties, controversies, and wrong decisions, he had followed a path similar to that of other players who, in the same period, faced the same challenges and won? The most obvious comparison has always been with Marcelo. The two arrived at Real Madrid practically at the same time. Both were young, talented, and had the world at their feet. But while one was lost in the illusion of fame and easy money, the other became a club legend. And the difference between the two was never talent. Drenthe was as explosive as Marcelo, as skilled as Marcelo. But something essential was missing: commitment. From the beginning, the Brazilian demonstrated that he was there to learn, to evolve, to become better and better. Constant evolution, total dedication, respect for the process. He knew that being at Real Madrid was a privilege, and that, to stay at the top, it took more than pure talent. What if Drenthe had understood this in time? If I had accepted that, in football, no one survives on skill alone? If he had seen Marcelo as an example to be followed, and not as a rival who was taking away his space, what could have happened? The answer is simple. Drenthe could have been one of the best fullbacks in the world. He had everything for it. The same speed that made Marcelo a terror for opposing defenses, the same ability to attack like a winger and retreat like a solid defender, the same talent for plastic plays, for precise assists, for unexpected goals. He could have been a memorable name in the history of Real Madrid. But the difference between the two was mentality. While Marcelo listened to advice, dedicated himself to training, respected the team's hierarchy, Drenthe did the opposite. I believed that I had already reached the top and that I didn't need to work hard to stay there. But in football, no one reaches their peak without hard work. And that was his undoing. Now imagine another scenario. What if, in addition to following Marcelo's path, Drenthe had chosen a different manager? Many promising players manage to avoid failure because they have people on their side who truly care about their future. An agent who manages your career, who guides your decisions, who imposes limits when necessary. But Drenthe didn't have that. He trusted the wrong people. If your circle had been made up of competent professionals, your story could have been different. If someone had controlled his spending, warned him about the dangers of early fame, established smart contracts and investments, perhaps his fortune would still exist. But that's not what happened. Drenthe spent without limits, surrounded by self-interested friends and incompetent advisors. What if he had listened to Real Madrid's veterans when they tried to advise him? What if he had accepted the leadership of players like Casillas, Sergio Ramos, and Raul, who tried to show that his stance was wrong? If, instead of responding with arrogance, he had absorbed the teachings and understood that, in football, talent needs to be molded, honed, and respected, perhaps he would have become a legendary name in Holland. Maybe he would have been a fundamental part of the national team, played in World Cups, helped his country lift trophies. Maybe he would have made history at Real Madrid, won the Champions League, become an icon of European football. But the issue doesn't stop there. What if Drenthe had chosen other clubs in his career? If, instead of agreeing to go to Hercules, he had insisted on being loaned to a bigger club? If he had looked for a team that could develop him better, instead of accepting any offer just to leave Real Madrid? If you had gone to a club that required more professionalism and fewer distractions, would your trajectory have been different? What if he had accepted a secondary role for a while? Many players need to go through adaptation phases. Sometimes they need to wait on the bench, learn tactically, grow little by little. But Drenthe didn't want to wait. He wanted to be a protagonist from day one. And that was a fatal mistake. If he had been more patient, perhaps he would have had time to mature. But Drenthe's story also raises another question. What if he had been born in another time? Today, football is much more structured to deal with young promises. Clubs invest heavily in sports psychologists, financial consultants, and career development teams. Players are closely monitored and receive guidance on how to deal with fame, money, and the pressures of the game. If Drenthe had emerged in today's football, would he have been lost so quickly? Or would he have been guided before it was too late? Unfortunately, these questions will never be answered. What we know is that he wasn't the only one. The history of football is full of players who had everything to shine and failed due to bad decisions. But few have fallen as spectacularly as Drenthe. Few have had a descent so dramatic, so exposed, so talked about. And that's the weight of the what if. Because in the end, it no longer matters what could have been. What matters is what really happened. But has Drenthe accepted this reality? Or was it that, somewhere inside him, there was still hope of rewriting his story? Royston Drenthe, a name that was once synonymous with explosion, talent, and expectation, now lives far from the spotlight that once lit his path. The boy who enchanted the world at the U21 Euro, who wore the Real Madrid shirt, and who seemed destined for stardom, today faces a completely different reality. Time passed, opportunities ran out, and football, which once gave him everything, was also what turned its back on him. But where is Drenthe now? What is left of that player who, at some point, was compared to Roberto Carlos? The truth is that after so many falls, so many frustrated attempts to return to the top level, Drenthe finally had to accept something that previously seemed unthinkable. His professional football career was over. He no longer plays in the big leagues, no longer has million-dollar contracts, and is not even considered by relevant clubs. His career in football, which began so promisingly, dissolved over the years, a victim of his own choices. In recent years, Drenthe tried to stay connected to football in some way, But the scenario was very different from the one he once imagined for himself. He started to play in amateur leagues, in small clubs in the Netherlands, far from the glamour and grandeur of Real Madrid, teams that, a few years ago, he would never have considered accepting. But now, the reality was different. What once seemed like just a temporary fresh start has become his definitive new condition. He went through teams like the Kozak Ken Boys, a lower division team, where there were no longer big crowds, no valuable contracts, no cameras following him every step of the way. He was just a former player trying to stay active, clinging to a sport that no longer seemed to want anything to do with him. To many, this seemed to be a sign that he had finally matured, that he was accepting his new reality. But was that really it? Or was Drenthe still under the illusion that he could somehow become relevant again? The answer may lie in another curious detail about your current life. Even after everything, even after being ridiculed as a rapper, Drenthe still hasn't given up on music. Yes, he continues to try to make a career in rap. He releases new music, produces music videos, tries to promote himself, insists that he can still be successful in the music industry. Even after being rejected by the public, after becoming a joke, he refuses to accept that perhaps this is not his path either. But to what extent is this persistence, or just an inability to accept that his era of fame is over? Looking at his trajectory, it is difficult to understand to what extent Drenthe really learned from his mistakes. On the one hand, he recognizes that he could have made better choices. In interviews, he has admitted that he wasted opportunities, that he didn't take football seriously enough, that his mentality prevented him from reaching the level he could have reached. But at the same time, his actions still show someone who seems to cling to the past, who doesn't want to accept that his time has passed. Drenthe also had to face a harsh financial reality. The money that once seemed infinite no longer exists. The luxury, the parties, the sports cars, the gold watches, all of that is behind us. Today, his life is much more modest, far from the excesses he displayed when he was still playing at a high level. But that doesn't mean he has regained his stability. The choices you made in the past still take a toll in the present. And when you look at him now, you can't help but wonder, does Drenthe really regret everything that happened? Or does he, deep down, still believe that everything was as it should have been? In some statements, he has already suggested that he would not trade his story for anything. Who lived as he wanted, who enjoyed every moment, who has no regrets. But is this the truth? Or is it just a way to hide the pain of knowing he could have been so much more than he was? The repercussions of his career were not just personal either. Drenthe has become a living example of what not to do. The new generation of players looks at it and sees a warning. His name is now cited as a reference to wasted talent, as a reminder that skill is not always enough to guarantee a successful career. Sports analysts don't forget their history either. He is constantly mentioned in lists of greatest promises that didn't come to fruition, and players who played for Real Madrid and no one remembers. His name is marked in football history, but not in the way he dreamed. He will never be remembered as an idol, just like a player who could have been giant, but never managed to reach his true potential. And now the question remains, is this story really over? Or does Drenthe still hold out hope for one last act? One last move to try to change his own narrative? If this story has captivated you so far, subscribe to the channel to follow more incredible football stories. Because in the world of football, reality can always be even more surprising. Royston Drenthe had it all: the talent, the money, the fame, the opportunity to write your name in football history. He was acclaimed as one of the great promises of the sport, wore the Real Madrid shirt, and shared the dressing room with legends of the game. But what happened next was a collapse so quick and so absolute that few players have managed to fall in such spectacular fashion. His rise was meteoric, but his fall was even more dramatic. He went from millionaire to bankrupt, from promise to failure, from elite player to meme. Along this journey, we've seen all the moments that defined his career and his life. The childhood of dreams, stardom at Euro U21, the chance at Real Madrid, the first big wake-up call, the parties, the uncontrolled spending, the wrong friends, the impulsive decisions. We saw the club's patience running out, the coaches giving up on him, the fans turning their backs. We saw the loans, the failed attempts to reinvent themselves, the music, the bankruptcy, the regretful interviews, the afterthoughts on everything that happened. Now, looking at all this, the big question arises: what was Drenthe's biggest mistake? Was it your lack of discipline? Your inability to see football as a commitment and not just a spectacle? Your immaturity? His rejection of veterans' advice? Or his insistence on living like a Hollywood star rather than a professional athlete? Maybe it was his arrogance. Maybe it was your lack of patience. Maybe it was all of that together. But did he really never get a second chance? Because looking at his trajectory, we can see that he had not just one, but several opportunities to rise again. The loan to Hercules was a chance. Everton was another chance. His return to Dutch football was another chance. But none of them were enough to change his destiny. Football always offers new opportunities, but only to those who are willing to seize them. And the truth is, Drenthe never seemed to understand what it really took to stay on top. Why do some players manage to turn things around and others, like Drenthe, simply sink? The answer may lie in what we call a winning mindset. Talent can take you far, but it is discipline, humility, and mental strength that determine whether you will remain at the top or whether you will be just another forgotten name. Players like Cristiano Ronaldo, who trained obsessively for years, or even those who started out as supporting players and evolved into legends, like Luka Modric, show that success is not just a matter of raw talent. It is a commitment to excellence. Drenthe, however, never wanted that commitment. He wanted the glory. He wanted the applause. He wanted the million-dollar contracts. But I didn't want the hard work that came with it all. And football does not forgive anyone who is not willing to pay the price of success. And the most impressive thing is that, even after everything, Drenthe never saw himself as a failure. In several interviews, he demonstrated that he does not completely regret his choices. He says he lived his life the way he wanted, that he enjoyed every moment, and that he wouldn't trade his story for anything. But is this the truth? Or is it just a way to mask the pain of knowing he could have been so much more? Because at the end of the day, Drenthe isn't just a player who lost money or fame. He is the portrait of what happens when someone wastes the gift they have received. Thousands of young people dream of having an opportunity in professional football, but never get there. Drenthe has arrived. He had everything in his hands, and wasted. And his story raises another question. If he had received more support, if he had been surrounded by people who truly wanted to help him, would his fate have been different? Many talented players end up falling victim to the system itself, surrounded by business people who only think about money, by friends who want to enjoy their success, by a bubble of illusion that makes them believe they are untouchable. And when they realize reality, it is already too late. Looking at the players who managed to build successful careers, the difference between them and Drenthe becomes even more evident. He wasn't the only young man to arrive at Real Madrid with great expectations. Marcelo also arrived early, but knew how to wait for his moment. Vinicius Jr. faced heavy criticism, but maintained the right mentality. Jude Bellingham, still very young, already demonstrates the attitude of a leader. The history of football shows that talent is not enough. It takes maturity, work, and, above all, respect for the sport. But has Drenthe really learned this lesson? Because even after so many years, he is still trying somehow to stay in the game. He still appears occasionally in the media, still tries to score songs, still makes public appearances as if hoping for a return to relevance. Does he still believe he can rewrite his story? Or is it that, deep down, he just can't accept that his era has passed? And now the question goes to you. Did Drenthe deserve another chance? Or did he himself dig his own ruin? Comment below and tell me what you think about this unbelievable story. And for those of you who like this type of content, what appears on the screen will impact you. Click and see the most shocking journey of all time.